This is Center Stage, putting your firm in the spotlight by highlighting business owners and other industry experts to help take your firm to the next level. Hey everyone, and welcome to Center Stage. I'm your host, John Henson, and this week we're talking about something that I think a lot of people, maybe in the legal industry especially, aren't exactly really sure how to define, and that is inclusivity. We hear that term thrown around a lot, but I think a lot of people still don't have really a full grasp of all that entails. And this week, I want to cover that and really, especially talk about how you can make your firm a more inclusive environment. And so joining me this week is the founder and CEO of Relationships at Work, Dr. Debra Dupree. Debra, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here.
Awesome. So before we dive in, tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and why this subject is really important to you.
Well, there's quite a story behind that, but I'll keep it brief and short. I have to admit, I grew up in a very large family, which is really sort of the impetus for why I am so passionate about working with teams of people, because we were like a small team of 9 kids, believe it or not, within a family-owned business. And we ranged not over a lot of years, but there were some generational differences. And, I just saw the conflict that erupted between people, how poorly they communicated, the dashed dreams, the broken hearts, the damaged relationships. And it just fueled my passion for really, diving deep into the dynamics of human behavior. And taking that further is that I've been married to not one, but 2 attorneys, and I've seen firsthand the challenges that they face, and because of that, I chose not to go into the field of law, but I've worked with lawyers all my life, and personally and professionally, and been an expert witness, and done all kinds of investigative kinds of things from a psychology perspective. And so I just really see the challenges, the rigors that attorneys go through, and have taught law school as a non-attorney. And I admire attorneys. That's why I keep working with them. And I love the logical, analytical mind that they're trained with in law school. Unfortunately, it just continues to carry over to their personal lives and in their personal relationships with their clients in ways that don't always serve them well.
Yeah, love it. So, we're talking about inclusivity, and it's one of the kind of the newer things, kind of in the bigger picture of just other things that a business owner needs to take into consideration with their team and even how they conduct themselves with their clients. And so broadly speaking, what does inclusivity mean? And, really it goes beyond just race, ethnicity, gender, kind of the standard sort of demographics. Why is that?
Well, that's a powerful question right there. You're right. It's getting a lot more attention. I've worked in the arena of diversity training for over 20 years, and we've come a long way. And some of the events over the last 2 or 3 years have really opened our eyes to say, "Oh, we've come a long way, but boy, do we still have a long way to go." And when I talk about, from my version of inclusivity, it's well, and again, particularly tying it back to lawyers, but leaders in general, is that we oftentimes are hired and praised for what we know, how smart we are, but it doesn't really take into consideration how well or how effective we are in dealing with people. And it ties into the concept of what I call psychological safety. Now, I didn't start that term. Amy Evison from Harvard is one who has really espoused that term and has been talking about it for over 10 years. But I like to say we've come a long way in building physical safety, with all of our safety protocols and things like that. We've not come so far at all in building psychological safety. And that's where people feel included. They
Mhm.
feel safe. There's a space where they can speak up and be heard without being shot down, criticized, ridiculed, etc. And so when we go back to the mindset again of attorneys, they're really trained to think about things from a factual standpoint.
Right.
What's the evidence? But they're not really trained in how to deal with the people emotional component. And that's where shifting our mindset, shifting our strategies to pay attention to how are people impacted.
Mhm.
Here I like to say, what are the facts that we're dealing with? But
Yeah.
then how are you impacted? And by looking at how they're impacted, we get at underlying interests and what's important to them to then formulate how do we move forward in a way that's future focused in terms of resolving conflict. And so inclusivity really means taking time and attention. It's not a lot of time. That's what scares up people, I think, is that,
Right.
oh, if I
Yeah.
go down that rabbit hole with people about where they're coming from, I'll never get out. But the reality is that there are safe and effective techniques that we can use so that people feel included, they feel heard. Um, in particularly after coming out of COVID, that seems to be even so more important across many lanes of traffic, shall we say, in the work world, and how professionals show up with their employees, how they lead. Um, it's amazing, just the shift in mindset. It's always been there, and we've
Right.
been successful, but
Yeah.
it's taking a different turn these days.
Yeah. So, we and I kind of expressed this to you, as we were getting to know each other, before we recorded, we actually internally had someone come in and talk to our team just about inclusivity and all that kind of stuff. And I walked away with a lot of other questions because there's, you know, to me, there's so many different, and I think you can appreciate this, we're working with attorneys. There's so many different if then situations and scenarios that it does seem very daunting, and I can see why maybe a lot of business owners maybe recoil at that and kind of, to your point, think that it's going to be such a huge time investment that it's another thing that they have to go through. But I like where we've started here, because I think you've done a really good job of explaining a lot of things. One term that I hear a lot in this sort of conversation is the concept of unconscious bias, and that's where I wanted to start. And you'd mentioned a couple other things that I'm going to come back to in a minute, but what is unconscious bias in terms of this whole conversation?
Well, that's again another important concept to look at because we all, we are influenced hugely by our
Yeah.
upbringing, our
Right.
culture, our religion, our region, whatever that might be. That's
Hmm.
part of who we are. I like to call, I teach a course with what is called cultural competency. And like you
Yeah.
said earlier, it goes beyond race, ethnicity, gender, age, etc., and dives deeper into what I like to deal with the four basic communication styles as the first differentiator
Hmm.
beyond our race and gender, uh, because it's not something we quite see, but we certainly behave in ways according to our communication styles. And there are four. I'm not going to go into those now because that's not part of our conversation, but how we look at the world
Hmm.
by these different influences will shape our attitude, therefore our bias towards one another. And I could look at you and say, you know, oh yeah, I'm totally open to speaking to you. But in my mind, I might say, oh, well, he's wearing glasses or he's bald or, whatever,
Right. Yeah.
And so those are the biases that we talk about. And and so this is where I love what Henry Yampolsky, an attorney turned mediator turned educator from Pennsylvania, had to say. It's like mindfulness. Mindfulness is not just about feeling better for
Mhm.
ourselves. And oftentimes we think about mindfulness as like, how are we doing? But mindfulness is again not just feeling better about ourselves, but getting better
Yeah.
at sensing where others are coming from. And so this is where it really begs the opportunity to take a look at, hmm, what are my beliefs? What are my values? What attitudes therefore biases might I have about certain people,
Yeah.
certain attitudes, certain how they show up. That's why I oftentimes talk about how you show up matters,
Yeah.
and because we can have again a bias or an attitude towards people and not even be aware of it. And
Yeah.
so the self-awareness, go back to emotional intelligence. It goes
Yep.
back to self-awareness, self-management, and then other awareness, and then relationship management. I go back to the four core ones from Daniel Goleman's basic work. And so this unconscious bias is again really taking a deeper look, a deeper dive, and in our attitudes towards people, because it will affect how we deal with people and then how people respond to us.
Yeah.
Leadership is not just about directing people and what to do, but also how well do they follow you.
Right. Yeah. I mean, kind of a real obvious example that comes to mind, is like, let's say you're an attorney and then you either meet or work with maybe another attorney from Africa. Right.
Mhm.
And look, they may be a different race than you, but you may not, you're obviously, I don't think anybody's going to be like, yes, I'm a racist, blah, blah, blah. No one's going to say that. But you may not see the color of their skin and treat them any differently because of it. But there's always just been this pervasive sort of perception of Africa as a continent that it is a little bit lesser than, less privileged, maybe, and then that can sort of turn into, well, maybe their education system's not good. So maybe he's not as good of a lawyer as I am, or whatever the case may be.
Mhm.
And like, to that point, you're not necessarily actively consciously thinking of those things, but it's literally the unconscious sort of way we've been conditioned to think about those things. And I think that's what all of this is really trying to address.
Yeah, exactly. I'll go back to my upbringing again, because while my father was very charismatic in our community, and certainly a pillar of the community, a great businessman and so forth, but even when I was really young, I think I was about 8 years old when he would say things about certain people, and it's like, do you know that person? No.
Right.
Well, then how can you say that about somebody? I mean, if you don't know them.
Yeah.
And he is, well, that's just what I know about that kind of person. Oh,
Hmm.
and so I learned very young about the impact, the effects of stereotyping, and again,
Yep.
the attitude and the bias that someone can hold. Clumping people into a group of people just because they happen to have similar characteristics without really knowing the person. And that's why it's so important to be conscious of, stereotypical attitudes or notions about people. You mentioned a good one, geographical regions, for example.
Yeah.
Um, and again, quite honestly, while there were a lot of positive things from my father, there were also some negative things, but
Right.
it really prompted me to take a bigger look at people, and partly why I moved away from where I was. It was a great place to grow up, but I wanted something more diverse. I wanted to be around, a richer population of different people and learn from them and learn different cultures and things like that. And it's so important to know know a little bit about someone's story. And again, it
Yeah.
doesn't have to take a lot of time to go there, but it is important. And since I work a lot with attorneys and mediators, um, trying to sort of revolutionize the whole field of mediation in a way, and said, we can't just dive into the facts and expect that we're going to resolve a case on the facts alone, because because behind every conflict, there's a personal story. Why do you
Right.
feel so strongly about this? And that's where, being aware again of our own bias and what we think we need to do to get to resolution, and how to shift that and still be very powerful. And it doesn't take a lot of time.
Right. Yeah. The other big term that often gets associated with this is privilege.
Mm.
And there's been sort of a negative connotation around the term white privilege from people who maybe don't feel privileged, but then also don't realize kind of all of the different areas where privilege comes into play. Because I think a lot of people hear the term privilege or white privilege and they apply it kind of across the board. Whereas I think one of the big things that I learned was that you can be privileged in one aspect, but then be, I forget the term, but just, underserved or underprivileged in another area. Can you
Mhm.
kind of expand on that and just kind of what you've seen in that regard?
Yes. Again, we've seen a tremendous revolution of thinking in the last few
Yeah.
years. Uh, I like to oftentimes go back, the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, and here we
Uh,
are, many, many years later, and still dealing with things. And like I mentioned, is that I've been working with the area of diversity for over 20 years, and the George Floyd, incident back in May of 2020, I mean, really woke us up and said, wow, okay, we have come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. And it was like just under the surface boiling. And
yeah.
again, it tied into then, and it still goes on today, as far as that privilege or underserved aspects. And so, again, it's that application of bias, of stereotyping, in terms of people who may, for example, who are white, may not feel privileged. They may
Mhm.
feel underserved because of their socioeconomic circumstances or whatever. And this
Yeah.
is where we get into trouble by applying, stereotypical notions to just because you look like doesn't mean you are. And
Yeah.
so, uh, now, are there some advantages? I'm going through some personal change myself, and I'm recognizing the cultural differences
Right.
just because of how I look, because of where I am. But that's why we have protections around those kinds of things, because I didn't choose to be born into a Swedish Norwegian background with blonde hair and blue eyes. That's my
Yeah.
family upbringing. What can
Right.
I had no choice over that. But and to help people recognize going beyond that, just because you are born into certain circumstances doesn't mean that you are automatically granted certain privileges and things like that. And so really helping people understand and recognize their own individual worth. And again, going beyond those obvious things into those less obvious things in
Yeah.
terms of personal beliefs and values, expectations, attitudes, concerns, challenges, hopes, fears, values, and needs. Those are
Yeah.
sort of the framework I use when I'm working with people to understand what's important to you, where you're coming from, and
Yeah.
then given where you're coming from, given the issue or challenge in front of us, then how do we move forward in a way that works for you and works for the other person?
Yeah. And I think the key there is just like you just can't, apply and generalize it across the board. Like it truly is, every person, it should be taken as a unique consideration. And you can't, what about one person can't automatically be applied to another person based on so many different factors. And so yeah, just all of that just really really important. So how does someone where does someone even begin then to start probably taking these things into consideration, being more conscious of them, and so that it doesn't feel so overwhelming? Because I mean, you've mentioned a couple of times it really isn't a big time commitment. It's not difficult to do, but how does someone even get started doing something like this?
Well, again, a good question. First, I like to say it takes courage to be curious.
Yeah.
Okay. And so we oftentimes think, oh yeah, I can do whatever, but are we really coming from a mindset of being curious about where are people coming from? And so that's first and foremost is taking a look at self and just saying, what gets in my way. I think particularly with a lot of attorneys, um, because of the training uh, that goes beyond our basic communication styles. Um, Again, people are oftentimes taught to leave their emotions checked at the door. And the
Mhm.
reality is, I'm sorry, emotions precede all cognitions. We know that from a neuropsychological behavioral perspective. And so if
Yeah.
you ignore the emotions, you're not going to get very far. I mean, you might, but you're not going to have very happy customers, and you're not going to have very, successful resolutions that can actually be enforced and carried out. And so as far as the attorneys getting started, I have to admit that there is just a plethora of resources now available. I'm so excited really about where I see the world, particularly the legal world, shifting in terms of
Mhm.
paying attention to these other human dynamics. I know that the mental health and well-being of attorneys is a much bigger issue.
Mhm.
The American Bar Association is working on programs and delivering services and to provide support. I've had a number of guest speakers on my own podcast addressing that kind of concern. Uh, and and then the other thing too is that I mean, I see some great stuff coming out of Harvard and Stanford in terms of the research and neuroscience of human behavior. And pay attention, there's continuing education is always required, but there are some really tremendous programs out there. And I particularly emphasize and recommend that people pay attention to learning more about emotional intelligence. Um, I know Daniel Goleman's first book is like about, almost 3 inches thick on emotional intelligence, and probably not a good read for the attorney, but it's Daniel Goleman's still alive and he does
Yeah.
tremendous posts on LinkedIn, and
Yeah.
so there are a lot of good ways. And certainly connecting with me, I have adopted or developed a program called the Agile Lawyer Mediator in terms of really taking a look at the mindset and thinking about how to look at people problems differently. um,
Yeah.
there's there's always a legal case, but there's a factual case, but there's always a people case. And
Yeah.
so, getting better about working with people on the emotional level, because again, emotions precede cognitions. And if we can help people feel heard,
Yeah.
feel listened, we'll get a lot further along and we'll be a lot happier in our careers.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things that I think, really opened my eyes and kind of where my starting point was actually realizing the areas where I did have privilege versus areas where I might be more oppressed or underserved. For example, as a male, okay, yes, privileged, white, privileged. But then maybe on the other side, I'm not super religious, but
Mhm.
I live in a very religious area. That has a big impact. Growing up, maybe you're living in a more rural area, but you lean more blue with your political views. That could be a form of, underprivilege or oppression, stuff like that. So many different things, and so it's just interesting to see, just kind of how things shake out in that regard. I wanted to go back to you mentioned the concept of psychological safety, and I want to make sure that we hit on that as well. How does someone make their firm a psychologically safe place for their team?
Again, a powerful question. I go back again to the structure of many firms. Again, their training, their the legal analysis that goes on, and so people in a law office are quick to jump to uh, conclusions and perceptions about the facts of the situation, and
Mhm.
uh, and so that's something that affects workplaces of all kinds, but I think it's particularly true in the legal office. There's a lot of pressure for billing. There's a lot of pressure for bringing in clients
Yeah.
without recognition of the toll it takes on people. And I've experienced that uh, indirectly firsthand,
Yeah.
having been married to an attorney in a law firm, and continue to see that. In terms of building psychological safety, it really is about creating that space that it's okay to
Hmm.
talk about concerns and perceptions about differences of uh, in how cases may be evaluated, the impact on lives,
Yeah.
and oftentimes, the business comes first, taking
Yeah.
priority over the person's well-being as well as the person's family of choice, whatever that might be, and and so it really is paying more attention to our mental health, our well-being, taking care of ourselves, and actually taking care of each other too, being supportive of things. And so I like to use the model of Patrick Lencioni, uh, famous sort of business leader guru, who
Hmm.
who the book I most draw upon, he's written several, is Death by Meetings. And so
Hmm.
most people say, oh, we have too many meetings, but he would say that we don't have enough meetings of the right kind. And so he has a formula for different types of meetings, different durations of meetings, different purposes of meetings, and how to use them constructively. And I've brought that into many organizations and offices in the past and been very successful. But what, the basic daily huddle, just like the
Hmm.
military often does, checking in with each other. How you doing? What's going on? What's hot? What's not? Who needs additional resources today because of what's happening? And how can we shift or reallocate our supportive resources to help people get through the situation without leaving them to struggle on their own? And and it's amazing what sense of community and what sense of support that can rally for people, and feeling, okay, they got my back. So psychological safety is really creating that sense of, I've got your back. And
Yeah.
again, it doesn't have to be in major ways. We're talking about daily huddles that maybe last 5, 10, 15 minutes. If you go beyond that,
Yeah.
you just got the purpose of the meeting.
Yeah.
And you can do that remotely, or you can do that in person, or a hybrid version. And so it
Yeah.
really is a sense of community and helping people feel connected. The other thing I would say about psychological safety is that when people say, oh, let's come together and brainstorm about how to approach this. Too often the concept of brainstorming is just whittled away in a matter of minutes, because the true concept of brainstorming is that any idea, it gets floated and any idea gets put up there,
Hmm.
and then you start having a discussion about the merits of the ideas.
Yeah.
And too often after two or three, you get somebody who goes, oh, well, that will never work. It's like, okay, well, then you teach people not to speak up. You teach people not to voice their ideas and concerns, and people don't feel safe.
Yeah. Yeah. That's such a great point, because I've been there. And, I'm fortunate that, like, we have an owner and a leadership team here who, even one of our core values is win together. And we talk about being open and honest with each other, and all that. So there's always lines of open communication. And so I've never, I've had ideas get rejected, but I've never felt like my opinion was undervalued, because I've always been able to go and talk to people, be like, okay, well, why? What can I do better next time? But, not everybody has that, confidence, or even that feeling that they can go and do that. And so that's a really good a point that you made. One last thing I wanted to cover, and I think that this is really important. um you know Last few years, there have been a lot of big advancements in our overall understanding of mental health.
Mhm.
And you know we see a lot more talk about, like, neurodivergence and the neurodivergent community. That can entail a lot of different things. It could be ADHD, OCD, even the autism spectrum, which I am part of that. And I wanted to know from you, how can firms be more inclusive towards that community? Because it's still often a little, it's still not fully understood. And I've talked before. I think this was the episode I actually had my therapist on, and we did an episode and we talked about this, where
Wow.
you know my hope in 30, 40 years is that a lot of the neurodivergent stuff is not seen necessarily as a disability. It's just a different category of abilities, right?
Mhm.
But like you said, what are the facts right now? The facts right now is that neurodivergence, a lot of it is seen as a disability. But how can a firm be more inclusive to people in the neurodivergent community?
Yeah, all great points. And so I've worked in the area of let's say disability for many, many years.
Yeah.
Got my career started in that direction. And so I happened to be in a very pivotal point when the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. It was just, landmark. It still is. It's
Yeah.
been with us now for over 32 years. What I learned over the course of my years is that, many there are many medical conditions, and so I have learned to reframe the concept of disability to medical condition. And because when we talk about medical conditions, we all have them,
Right.
to some degree. Okay. And so it is a part of living. And what I learned from my clientele is I work a lot with disability in the workplace.
Yeah.
That, many people, yeah, they have conditions, but they don't consider themselves disabled.
Right.
But it may impact their ability to be at work, stay at work, and perform the work. And so it's about reframing that whole concept. And it's sort of like, the word handicap parking
Hmm.
is really, passe. It's really old school.
Hmm.
Now in terms of, again, even shifting to disability parking is better than handicap parking. But even then, it's like, well, okay, disability,
Yeah.
that sort of implies an ongoing long-term condition where, again, some people may need temporary accommodation for parking,
Yeah.
that because of a medical condition. And so right there, it's reframing the mindset.
Yeah.
Uh, Hence why I call myself the mindset doc. Reframing the mindset to, let's take a look at the language we use. And is it really appropriate, or is it really old school? And that's one of the things I work with attorneys too, is taking the language of the courtroom out of the world of mediation, because we're setting up a whole different dynamic when we use courtroom language in a mediation setting. So the same thing applies here, is that if we can reframe disability into medical conditions, guess
Yeah.
what? Again, we're all going to face them at some point, somewhere, somehow, and it could happen to you, whether
Yep.
it's hypertension, for example, alcohol or substance abuse, which is a high indicator in the lawyer field,
Yeah.
overweight.
Yeah.
Okay, all of those things are prevalent in the world of law, unfortunately. And so those are medical conditions, not disabilities. And so if we can take a look at, okay, how can we adjust how we approach things? And again, how can we increase your well-being? You know, if it's sort of like, if I keep doing the same thing over and over again, guess what? I'm going to get the same result.
Right.
And so that's where law firms, I encourage them to rethink their approach to doing the business of law, because we're creating a lot of unhealthy lifestyles and medical conditions that ultimately
Yeah.
don't serve the individual well. And I see that particularly, I've been a trainer of professionals in, shifting into mediation for a long time. And one of the things, as we called them, the recovering attorneys, uh, that they were simply burnt out with doing the litigated approach and the traditional business of law, and felt that they needed to find a different way to apply their skills and knowledge. And I see that so much in the lawyer world that I deal with, as far as people just, I want a different way of living, and how much happier and peaceful and better off, health wise and attitude wise, and by making shifts in how they do things. And so,
Yeah.
um, again, it gets back to mindset, and being actively conscious about how we approach things and the impact it has on us, as well as the people we serve.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest ironies that I've always found with the legal industry. Stereotypically, lawyers are very set in their ways. They're very resistant to change, despite the fact that the laws that they are interpreting are constantly changing and they're
Yeah.
constantly being updated. And so, and even in seeing how they run their businesses, and with new technology slow to adopt all of that as well. And so again, it's just a great reminder that to just encourage you to be open to new ideas and new ways of doing things. Because the high likelihood of a new thing being worse, or a detriment to the old thing rather than an improvement, is very, very low. So yeah, just a lot of good stuff there. How can people get in touch with you, learn more about all of the services and the resources that you provide?
Well, thank you for asking me. Um, Actually, the best way to reach out is to reach out on LinkedIn, Dr. Debra Dupree. And again, I do have an Agile Lawyer Mediator group where I provide tips and techniques and resources, etc. That's really a great way. I also have a website called relationships-at-work.com. and have a page dedicated to the lawyer services and mediator services that I provide. And I do provide one-on-one coaching for people who want to get some short-term guidance and tips about how they can make some shifts and take a look at the challenges that they have. And I've long taken a different approach. Even though I am a psychologist, I take a different approach to working one-on-one with people in terms of, it's not therapy, that's a medical model, but instead a coaching model that says, okay, where are you challenged and how do we move forward? And in fact, I was just received a reach out on LinkedIn yesterday from a client I'd worked with a couple of years ago who has a medical condition, and she was just saying how much I had helped her in taking a look at her medical condition and providing her with tips and techniques, and how she now is in a very prominent leadership role that she has struggled to get for a long time. So, so visit me on LinkedIn. I also have, my own podcast, Decoded the Conflict Mindset, which many guests are attorneys, mediators, people who've made changes in their lives as far as decoding the conflict mindset, and for self as well as others.
Awesome. Yeah, I definitely recommend checking out that podcast and checking out all the things that Dr. Dupree has available to you. This is going to do it. There's so much good information there. It was a good refresher for me, but, from the workshop that we had done internally and still learning, always a good reminder to just, reframe things and not necessarily the way that we've always done things is the way that we all have to continue to do things as well. One final question for you, though, before I let you go. If you had one final piece of advice for our listeners, what would it be?
Well, I think, we all have our low times, our low moments. And so there's sort of two phrases I've come up with. Out of adversity comes opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
And out of moments of pain comes the momentum for gain. And so, to stop and reflect, pause, and just say, how am I doing? What's going on for me? And how do I want to show up, differently? And am I achieving the kind of impact I want to achieve with the clients I serve? And where can I get better? Because we can all, again, press the facts and our knowledge of the law. There used to be, a huge emphasis through the 80s and 90s were on being subject matter experts. How smart are we? How good are we, in our knowledge of whatever it is that we do? But that doesn't quite cut it today for self and for others. They want to know more of that personal connection, and so it really is about bringing out our skills and abilities. And the good news is that it's learnable in terms of growing our emotional intelligence and the well-being that evolves from that. I see my clients time and time again just say how much their lives have been enhanced, increased by learning, living, and growing on an ongoing basis. So grow your emotional intelligence. That is going to sell you and keep you going far further than your intellectual intelligence.
Awesome. Love it. Yeah. And definitely, something that I'm going to look into more and just seeing, just always looking for ways to improve and finding ways to reframe things and better understand, everything that we've got going on. So Dr. Dupree, absolutely great. As always, thank you all for continuing to listen. Please rate and review the show wherever you are watching or listening, and continue sending in the feedback. What kind of topics would you like us to cover? How are you enjoying the show? We really do want to hear from you and get your thoughts on that. And that's going to do it for us this week. Dr. Dupree, thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. To learn more, go to spotlightbranding.com/centerstage.